The story begins with the rhythmic, comforting sounds of a closing diner, the clink of heavy ceramic mugs, and the low hum of the grease trap, a routine Meeker knows by heart. This peaceful monotony is suddenly shattered, not by a predator's growl, but by the heavy, wet thud of a body collapsing against the back service door. Much like a healing sense flaring to life at the side of a wounded cub, Mika's own intuitive instinct for preservation pulls her towards the sound rather than away from it. The hook locks the audience's attention when this hard-working, invisible waitress stands over a man in a blood-soaked three-piece suit, refusing to close the door, even as the muffled shouts of armed hitmen begin to echo from the far end of the alleyway. The story introduces Mika Akeem, a black waitress who has spent years living on the edges of a city that treats her like she is unremarkable, much like a ghost moving through a crowded room. With her tired eyes and hands roughened by endless double shifts, she is often looked through by the customers she serves, leading to a life of quiet, bone-deep isolation. For years, Mika has survived by being the person no one notices, wandering between her cramped apartment and the neon-lit diner, offering her small acts of kindness and her grandmother's traditional remedies to anyone who looks like they're hurting. She should have locked the back door and called the police when the storm of violence reached her doorstep, but her survival instincts are suddenly overridden by a flare of empathy, a visceral awareness of another's pain that pulls her towards the dying stranger. There, she finds Do-won, the most feared Korean mafia boss in the city, gasping for air in a pool of blood. Despite being a nobody who has spent her life staying out of trouble, Mika decides in that moment that she is tired of being the girl who watches the world suffer from the sidelines. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The grease-stained walls of the diner kitchen felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the scent of old frying oil and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Mika's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to choke her as she looked down at the man collapsed at her feet. Do-won was a haunting sight. His expensive charcoal suit was shredded, soaked through with a crimson that looked black under the flickering fluorescent lights. He was fading fast, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "Please," she whispered, though he was far beyond hearing. "You have to move." With a strength born of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, Mika hooked her arms under his and dragged him toward the heavy stainless steel door of the walk-in freezer. Every inch felt like a mile. The sound of his heels dragging against the linoleum floor seemed deafening in the sudden silence of the diner. She shoved him inside, tucking him behind a stack of industrial-sized produce crates, and pulled a clean apron over his blood-soaked torso. The cold air hit her face, a biting contrast to the heat of her panic. She had just clicked the heavy latch shut when the bell above the front door chimed. Mika smoothed her uniform with trembling hands, splashed cold water on her face at the prep sink, and stepped out into the dining area. Two men stood by the counter. They didn't look like the usual late-night truckers or exhausted nurses. They wore long coats that didn't quite hide the unnatural bulk at their hips, and their eyes moved with a predatory, calculated stillness. "Evening," Mika said, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and reached for a glass pot of decaf. "You boys looking for a booth?" "Just the counter," the taller one replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He sat down, his gaze scanning the kitchen pass-through behind her. "Coffee, black, and we're looking for a friend. Thought he might have taken a shortcut through your alley." Mika poured the coffee, the liquid swirling dark and steaming. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. To be invisible is to be safe. She forced herself to meet his eyes, playing the role of the tired, unremarkable waitress she had been for years. "Alley's empty, save for the trash. Haven't seen a soul since the midnight rush." The second man leaned over the counter, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the formica. "You sure about that, sweetheart? Because he's hurt. Might be looking for a place to hide." "Only thing hiding in my kitchen is tomorrow's special," Mika retorted, a flash of defensive steel entering her tone that surprised even her. The men lingered, sipping the bitter coffee and watching the back door with eyes like sharks. Behind the thick steel of the freezer door, Mika knew Do-won was bleeding out in the dark. Every second they sat there was a second he slipped closer to the grave. She gripped her serving tray so hard her knuckles turned white, realizing that the nobody she had always been was now the only thing standing between a dying king and his executioners.
The tension in the diner had reached a snapping point, the silence thick enough to choke on as the two men finished their coffee. Just as the taller one stood up, his hand reaching toward the heavy bulge beneath his coat, the street outside was suddenly flooded with a blinding, clinical light. A fleet of black sedans screeched to a halt in front of the diner's plate glass windows, their engines idling with a low, predatory rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The two hitmen froze, in faces draining of color, as the diner doors were kicked open. A dozen men in sharp, midnight-colored suits poured in, moving with a terrifying, synchronized precision that made the previous two look like street thugs. At their head was a man with cold, calculating eyes, who didn't even glance at the menu or the counter. He looked directly at Mika, his gaze sweeping over the faint smear of blood on her cheek that she'd forgotten to wash away. "Where is he?" the man demanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp. Mika stood her ground behind the counter, her hands hidden beneath the formica ledge, clutching her grandmother's old copper kitchen knife. She looked at the newcomers, then at the two hitmen who were now being shoved against the wall by the newcomer security detail. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't just stepped into a street brawl, she had stepped into a war. "The freezer," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming neon. "He's in the freezer." The men moved past her without a word, the leader pausing only for a fraction of a second to look at her with a flicker of something that might have been respect. When they pulled the heavy steel door open, a collective indrawn breath filled the kitchen. They didn't treat him like a victim. They treated him like a fallen god. "Chairman," she heard them whisper, their voices thick with a reverence that chilled her blood. As they carefully lifted Do-won onto a portable stretcher, the leader turned back to Mika. "You saved the life of the Dragon of Soul," he said, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers. "In our world, a debt of life is never forgotten, but it is also never free of consequence." Mika watched as they carried the stranger out toward the waiting fleet. She saw the way the city seemed to bend around them, the way the streetlights reflected off the polished black metal of the cars. She was no longer just a waitress who worked the graveyard shift. She was the girl who had hidden the most dangerous man in the country in her pantry. And as the cars sped away into the night, she realized that the invisible life she had spent years building had just been incinerated in the heat of a dragon's den.
The drive up the winding mountain pass was a blur of dark pines and the silent, imposing profiles of the men in the front seat. Mika sat in the back of the sedan, her fingers digging into the buttery softness of the leather upholstery, a texture so alien to her calloused hands it felt like a provocation. Less than 3 hours ago, she was scrubbing dried egg yolk off a counter. Now she was being whisked toward a fortress of glass and stone that overlooked the city like a watchful predator. When the wrought iron gates groaned open to reveal the Do-won estate, Mika felt a wave of vertigo. This wasn't just a house, it was a monument to power. The air up here was thinner, colder, and smelled of expensive cedar and rain rather than the familiar, comforting scent of deep fryer grease. As she was led through the soaring marble foyer, her sneakers squeaked against the pristine floor, a loud, jarring sound that made her feel like a smudge of dirt on a masterpiece. A fleet of silent, uniformed staff moved through the halls like shadows. One woman, her face a mask of professional indifference, led Mika to a suite in the north wing. The room was larger than the entire apartment Mika shared with her sister, filled with silk tapestries and furniture edged in real gold. "The chairman has requested you be made comfortable," the woman said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Everything you need has been provided. For your protection, you are not to leave these quarters without an escort." Mika stood in the center of the plush rug, her arms wrapped around her chest. The protection felt a lot like a prison sentence. She approached the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the shimmering lights of Seoul far below. Somewhere down there, the diner was sitting empty, the neon sign probably still flickering, and the blood she hadn't finished cleaning was drying on the linoleum. Up here, she was surrounded by a wealth that felt heavy, a gilded cage meant to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep her in. She caught her reflection in the darkened glass. She looked small, her waitress uniform stained and out of place against the backdrop of a palace. She had saved a man's life because it was the right thing to do, but as she listened to the heavy electronic click of the suite's lock, She realized she had traded her invisibility for a different kind of erasure. In the diner, she was a nobody who could walk away. Here, she was a secret, a ghost in a fortress of gold, waiting for a dragon to wake and decide what her life was worth.
The silence of the estate was broken not by a scream, but by the low, authoritative rumble of a man refusing to be handled. When the summons finally came for Mika, it was urgent and fraught with tension. She was led into a master bedroom that smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne, a room where the shadows seemed to bow to the figure in the center of the bed. Do-won was awake, his torso wrapped in heavy white bandages that stood out starkly against his bronze skin. A team of high-priced doctors stood awkwardly by the door, dismissed by a single icy glare from the man who had nearly died on her kitchen floor. "Out," Do-won rasped, his voice a ghost of the command it once held. "I told you, I don't want your needles. Bring me the girl." Mika stepped forward, her heart doing a frantic dance in her throat. She still felt like a fraud in this palace, but as she approached the bed, the dragon of soul softened. The predatory sharpness in his eyes faded into something raw and unrecognizable. He reached out a hand, his fingers surprisingly warm as they brushed against her wrist. "The doctors, they don't know the hands that held me together in the dark," he whispered, his obsidian gaze locking onto hers. With trembling hands, Mika sat on the edge of the silk sheets. She reached for a basin of warm water and a fresh cloth, moving with the practiced, gentle rhythm she had learned from her grandmother. As she began to clean the skin around his wounds, the air in the room changed. The distance between the billionaire king and the invisible waitress vanished, replaced by a heavy, magnetic intimacy. Every time her fingers grazed his skin, a spark of heat traveled up her arm, a silent conversation between the savior and the saved. Do-won watched her every move, his breathing evening out under her touch. "Why didn't you run, Mika?" he asked, using her name for the first time. The sound of it made her breath hitch. "You knew the men at the counter were death itself. Why stay for a stranger?" Mika didn't look up, focused on the jagged line of a scar near his ribs. "In my world, we don't have the luxury of turning away. If I didn't help you, I would have become just as invisible as the people who walk past me every day." He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, forcing her to look at him. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't a boss, and she wasn't a servant. They were two scarred souls finding a common language in the quiet of the night. "You saved a monster," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "And now, that monster belongs to you." The transition from the diner to the estate had brought many changes, but one thing remained constant: Mika's ability to become part of the architecture. In the days that followed her first intimate moment with Do-won, she realized that the high-ranking lieutenants and the security detail saw her exactly as the customers at the diner had. To them, she was merely the help, a silent fixture in the background. Because she didn't carry a weapon and didn't speak their language of power, she became a ghost in the halls of the fortress. While the dragon recovered in his suite, Mika wandered the limestone corridors, her soft-soled slippers making no sound. She wasn't supposed to leave the north wing, but the guards often looked right through her as she slipped into the service alcoves to find the traditional herbs she needed for Do-won's tea. It was during one of these quiet excursions that she found herself in the shadows of the West Conservatory, tucked behind a wall of towering jade plants. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and tension. From the other side of the greenery, a voice she recognized, Minho, Do-won's most trusted strategist, cut through the silence like a serrated blade. "The chairman is weak," Minho hissed, his tone devoid of the loyalty he performed in the light. "He is distracted by the girl. The hit in the alley failed, but the poison of sentiment is doing our work for us. We move when the shipment arrives at the docks on Friday. By the time he realizes the security codes have been changed, it will be too late for him, and for the waitress." Mika froze, her breath catching in her throat as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall. Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but the men continued, oblivious to the nobody just inches away. They were planning a coup, a systematic dismantling of Do-won's empire that started with the very man who claimed to be his shield. A cold shiver raced down her spine. In her invisible life at the diner, she had seen many things: unfaithful husbands, petty thieves, and small-time cons. But this was a different kind of darkness. These were the men Dewan trusted with his life, the ones who had bowed to him while sharpening their knives. She realized then that her invisibility was no longer a curse. It was a weapon. She was the only one who knew the dragon was being led to the slaughter. As she slipped away, merging back into the shadows of the hallway, Mika knew she couldn't just be a healer anymore. To save the man who had claimed her, she would have to use the very thing that made her disposable to strike back at the heart of the betrayal.
The estate's main kitchen was a cold cathedral of stainless steel and industrial precision, a place designed for production rather than comfort. But tonight, Mika had sent the professional chefs away, claiming she needed to prepare something specific for the chairman's recovery. Under the warm, yellow light of a single stove burner, the clinical atmosphere began to soften as the air filled with the earthy, soulful scent of slow-simmered spices and browning onions, the smell of the grandmother who had raised her. Dowan sat at the marble island, his frame still slightly hunched from the pain in his side, but his eyes were alert, tracking Mika's every movement. He watched her hands, the way she handled the ingredients with a quiet, practiced reference. When she finally placed a bowl in front of him, the steam carried a promise of a home he had never truly known. "It's not 5-star, Mika said softly, wiping her hands on her apron as she sat across from him. "But it's what we eat when we need to remember who we are." Dowan took a spoonful, and for a moment, the fearsome dragon of soul seemed to fracture. He looked down at the simple meal, his throat working as he swallowed. "My mother used to tell me that a man's strength is measured by the size of his shadow," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, uncharacteristic vulnerability. "But she died before I was old enough to have one. I was raised by the syndicate, fed on ambition and blood. I was an orphan of a kingdom that only valued me for how well I could fight." Mika reached across the marble, her hand resting near his. "I was an orphan of the streets," she replied, her voice a mirror of his honesty. "My grandmother was the only one who saw me. When she passed, I became a ghost. I worked that diner because if I stopped moving, I was afraid I'd just disappear entirely. We're not so different, Dowan. We both grew up in worlds that didn't have a place for us until we carved one out of nothing." The silence that followed was intimate, a bridge built between a palace and a diner. In the glow of the kitchen, the titles of Mafia boss and waitress fell away. They were simply two people who had spent their lives being hungry for a belonging they couldn't name. Dowan reached out, his fingers intertwining with hers, his grip firm and grounding. He realized then that he didn't just want her for her healing hands. He wanted her because she was the only person who had ever looked at him and seen the boy who had been left behind. As the shadows of the estate loomed outside the door, they sat in their small circle of light, two orphans finding a home in each other. The fragile peace of the kitchen was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in a home, the sharp, percussive stutter of automatic gunfire echoing through the marble halls. Before Mika could even gasp, Dowan's hand was on her shoulder, his grip like iron as he forced her toward the floor. The warmth of their shared dinner was instantly replaced by the biting scent of gunpowder and the cold, clinical efficiency of war. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice no longer the soft rasp of a healing man, but the bone-chilling growl of the dragon. From her position behind the heavy marble island, Mika watched the world she was starting to love dissolve into a nightmare. The kitchen's glass doors exploded inward as a flashbang detonated, the white light blinding her. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw the shadows of men, Minho's men, moving with lethal intent. She saw the flash of muzzles and heard the wet, heavy thuds of bullets finding home. Then she saw Dowan move. He was a blur of black silk and violent grace, his injuries forgotten in the heat of survival. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. With a combat knife he had pulled from a hidden sheath, he took lives with a speed that made Mika's stomach churn. She watched, paralyzed, as he stood over a fallen assassin, his face splattered with blood that wasn't his own. His eyes, which had looked at her with such tenderness just moments ago, were now twin voids of pitiless darkness. The skirmish ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving the once pristine kitchen a gallery of horrors. The smell of the stew she had cooked was now drowned out by the metallic, copper stench of fresh slaughter. Dowan turned to her, reaching out a hand to help her up, but Mika flinched.
She looked at his fingers, stained dark red, and then at the bodies on the floor. "Mika," he said, his voice trembling with a desperate sort of restraint. "This is the price," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The cold, the silk, it's all paid for in this." She looked at the man she had saved, the man she was falling for, and realized that her grandmother's remedies couldn't heal this kind of wound. The reality of his life wasn't just a story or a title. It was a visceral, bloody truth that demanded a sacrifice of the soul. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Mika felt the distance between the diner and the dragon's lair widen into an unbridgeable chasm. She had wanted to be seen, but she hadn't realized that once you look into the eyes of a monster, you can never go back to being a ghost.
The silence that followed the slaughter was heavier than the gunfire had been. In the dim light of the ruined kitchen, the flickering overhead lamp cast long, rhythmic shadows across the carnage. Do-won stood in the center of the room, the dragon of 1,000 stories, but his shoulders were slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. He looked at his hands, then back at Mika, who was huddled against the cold marble, her eyes wide with a terror that broke his heart more than any betrayal could. He didn't try to touch her this time. He knew the blood on his skin was a barrier she couldn't cross. Instead, he stepped back, giving her the space to breathe. "I spent my whole life building this throne," he said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. "I thought if I was powerful enough, I'd never have to be the scared boy in the alley again. But all I've done is build a bigger cage. And now I've pulled you into it." Mika looked at the shattered remains of the dinner they had shared. The soup was spilled, a dark stain on the floor that mimicked the blood of his enemies. "I can't be a part of this, Do-won," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wanted to see you, but I can't live in the dark." Do-won closed his eyes, a flicker of agony crossing his features. When he opened them, the cold intensity of the chairman was gone, replaced by a desperate human clarity. "Then we leave it behind." Mika froze, her breath catching. "What? The empire, the money, the blood?" He stepped forward, his eyes searching hers with a raw earnestness. "Minho thinks I'm weak because of you. Let him think it. Let him have the throne. It's a crown made of thorns, and I'm tired of bleeding." He reached out, his hand trembling as he held it palm up, an invitation rather than a command. "We can disappear, become ghosts again. Not because we're invisible to the world, but because we choose to be visible only to each other. No more dragons, Mika. Just a man who wants to wake up next to the woman who saved him." The magnitude of his offer hung in the air, a sacrifice so total it felt impossible. He was willing to strip away his name, his power, and his history, everything that defined him, just to keep her light from going out. Mika looked at his outstretched hand, seeing not the chairman of the syndicate, but the man who had shared his scars over a bowl of stew. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand hovering over his. The choice of the dragon wasn't about a battle won, it was about the war he was willing to lose for her. "You'd give it all up?" she asked softly. "I'd give up the world," he replied, his voice a vow. "Because without you, it's just a graveyard anyway." The transition was as silent as the snow that falls over the Han River in the dead of winter. To the world of the Syndicate, the Dragon of Soul had perished in the final, bloody purge of the North Wing, his body supposedly lost to the flames that consumed the traitor Minot and his hollow ambitions. The underworld moved on, as it always did, carving out new kings from the rebel. But the legend of the chairman and the waitress became a ghost story whispered in the dark, a myth of a man who traded a kingdom for a single heart. Hundreds of miles away, where the air smelled of salt spray and the pace of life was dictated by the tide rather than the clock, a small cafe stood at the edge of a quiet coastal town. Inside, the walls were decorated not with gold leaf, but with the warm, mismatched sketches of local artists and the lingering scent of slow-simmered spices. Mika stood behind the counter, her hands no longer trembling as she poured steaming coffee into heavy ceramic mugs. She was no longer invisible. She was the woman who knew the names of the fishermen's children and the specific way the lighthouse keeper liked his tea. She was a presence, a pillar, a person who was finally seen. When the bell above the door chimed, she didn't flinch. She looked up and smiled at the tall man entering from the rain, his face framed by a simple wool coat rather than the sharp lines of a charcoal suit. Do-won moved with a new kind of grace, the ease of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. The scars were still there, hidden beneath his sleeves, but the obsidian voids of his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, reflective depth. He didn't command the room, he inhabited it. He walked to the counter and reached for her hand, his large fingers intertwining with hers in a way that had become their daily anchor. There was no blood on his skin, only the faint dust of the wood he spent his afternoons carving in the shed behind their small cottage. They were no longer the monster and the nobody. They were simply two people who had found home in the wreckage of their former lives. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of amber and gold, they stood together in the doorway of their own making. They had chosen to be ghosts to the world so they could be real to each other. Their legend wasn't written in the headlines of the city's newspapers, but in the soft, steady rhythm of their shared breaths and the quiet joy of a life lived in the light. Moral of the story: true nobility is not found in the titles we hold or the power we wield, but in the quiet courage to protect a stranger when you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. It is the nobodies of the world who often possess the most significant hearts.